Last several months on the issue of marriage. Just last week, a U.S. district judge ruled that Kentucky must recognize so-called same-sex marriages from states where the unions are legal, even though Kentucky has a voter-approved constitutional amendment to the contrary. And then another federal judge invalidated Virginia's constitutional amendment on marriage, saying that same-sex marriage was a matter of fundamental fairness. Now, you put these decisions together with what's happened in Utah and with what's happened in Oklahoma and Ohio, and we are looking at some very problematic legal decisions when it comes to state sovereignty, the principle of federalism, and also marriage itself. And that is why it's so great to see that Texas Senator Ted Cruz and Utah Senator Mike Lee have now introduced the State Marriage Defense Act, which, as they put it, respects the definition of marriage held by the people of each state and protects states from the federal government's efforts to force any other definition upon them. And we are just really delighted to have with us today Senator Ted Cruz. It is wonderful to have you here, Senator. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Janet. It's always great to join you.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad that you've introduced this. Now, I go back to last summer. The Supreme Court at the time said the definition and regulation of marriage has been treated as being within the authority and realm of the separate states. So if that is truly the case, what is the deal with these federal judges telling states they have to recognize so-called same-sex marriage, even though the voters in those states legally decided they didn't want that?
Well, unfortunately, in the past decade or so, we have seen a steady, constant assault on marriage. And it has been an assault on marriage that has been brought by advocacy groups using litigation in the courts to tear down traditional marriage. And it's been an assault that has been led in significant part by the Obama administration. President Obama is the most hostile to traditional marriage president the United States has ever seen. And the administration has used its power to try to force gay marriage on all 50 states. And that is their stated agenda, is to tear down the marriage laws of every state in the union and force every single state to adopt gay marriage. And the bill that Senator Mike Lee and I introduced protects the authority of the people in each state to determine what the marriage laws will be in their state, so that each state can adopt marriage laws that reflect the values, reflect the mores of its citizens. And if this bill is passed, it'll serve as a bulwark to prevent the Obama administration from trying to undermine traditional marriage.
Well, right. Now, it's interesting. The LA Times is talking about same-sex marriage cases probably ending up back before the Supreme Court very shortly. And they note in this that the judges here have been saying they can see no legitimate justification for denying marriage licenses to same-sex couples. And they went on to say that the states, they say the Supreme Court said the states cannot validly base marriage laws on traditional religious disapproval of homosexuality. But they don't seem to have a reason constitutionally to say the opposite. So what is going on here legally where they're finding we can, as federal judges, impose upon the states what we think is fair, even though the U.S. Constitution doesn't even speak to the issue of marriage?
Well, it is judicial activism run amok, and that has been the reason for the litigation assault, is that the advocacy groups understood that they would be far more likely to get judges to set aside the marriage laws of the states than would be to convince the American people. And that, that's not the way our democratic system is supposed to work. It's not supposed to be unelected federal judges choosing the marriage laws they support. The way our federalist system works is that each of the 50 states has the authority over marriage. And if the citizens of a state make a decision that they want to adopt gay marriage, the Constitution gives them that latitude to do so. But just the same, if the citizens of a state decide, as the majority of states have, that they want marriage laws to reflect the union of one man and one woman, then the federal courts and the federal government should not be trying to tear down traditional marriage.
Right. But if you have judges, like we've seen with Vaughn Walker in San Francisco and some of these recent decisions, basically telling the people who have voted for these constitutional amendments that they're a bunch of bigots, yep, and they're taking away people's rights, and they're finding some kind of Fifth Amendment justification for this, the people feel very, very powerless. This is why this law is so important to get passed.
It is a consistent assault, and it's an assault that really comes from the use of power to subvert our democratic system. It is from advocacy groups that don't have the patience to actually win an argument with the people and make the case to the American people. If they want to advocate for their views, The First Amendment gives them the right to advocate, but they don't want to wait for that.
Right.
Instead, they just want to use brute power to force the states to take down marriage laws that have been in place for centuries, and that's inconsistent with the Constitution, and it's not right, and it's heartbreaking because you and I both know that the best environment for children to be raised is a loving home with a mother and father.
That's right. That's right. Hang on just a moment. Texas Senator Ted Cruz with us. We're going to come back talking about the State Marriage Defense Act. Stay with us. We are back. It's interesting to see as these federal judges have been weighing in and telling states that have constitutional amendments protecting marriage that they can't uphold those. One of the comments from Judge Hayburn in the Kentucky case was basically connecting the ban on same-sex marriage with the civil rights struggles against sexism and racism. Again, the civil rights argument. Texas Senator Ted Cruz and Utah Senator Mike Lee have introduced now the State Marriage Defense Act. Senator Cruz is joining us now. You were saying, Senator, before we went to the break, that the best environment, and this has been proven through multiple studies, the best environment for children is to be in a loving home with a mom and a dad. It doesn't really seem to matter to these judges, though. These studies, from what I've read, really don't seem to be cited much in these cases.
Well, unfortunately, this litigation is pursuing an agenda that is not slowed down by the facts, is not slowed down by millennia of traditional marriage being the foundation for the family, for the community. And, I will say, in addition to standing up and speaking out and passing legislation to protect marriage, I think the most important thing your listeners can do is simply pray, because we need a great deal of prayer, because marriage is really being undermined by a concerted effort, and it's causing significant harm.
Well, it sure is. Now, there was one legal issue that I wanted to ask you about because I found it really interesting. In the Kentucky case, two of those plaintiffs in the federal suit were actually married in Canada. Now, doesn't that open up a bit of a Pandora's box? If Kentucky is now told you have to recognize marriage that was legal somewhere else than in Kentucky, couldn't that, and this is a foreign country,
right,
couldn't this also open the door to telling Kentucky or any other state, you have to recognize polygamy because it's legal in Saudi Arabia and parts of Africa?
The stated objective of these advocacy groups is to tear down the marriage laws in all 50 states. And one of the ways that they want to do so is to require every state to recognize a marriage that is legal in any other state. And the consequence of that is that effectively legalizes gay marriage everywhere.
Yes.
And, if you look at what happened in Utah, for example, in Utah, you had an activist court that struck down Utah's marriage law. And then the U.S. Supreme Court stayed the effect of that, stepped in and said, no, don't set aside Utah's marriage law. And then the Obama administration came in and said the federal government is going to ignore the U.S. Supreme Court's order and is going to recognize as marriages what Utah state law does not recognize as marriage.
Yes.
And that, that instance more than any was the immediate impetus for this bill, because it really goes after the federal government abusing its power to try to undermine the traditional marriage laws of all 50 states.
You're totally right about that, because that was the essence of what the Supreme Court said, is that the federal government can't define marriage for itself but has to defer to the states. In the case of Utah, those marriages were not even legal in the state of Utah, and yet the federal government is saying we're going to recognize them as legal.
Well, that's exactly right, and it is the stated agenda of the Obama administration to tear down traditional marriage laws in every state across the union.
It's horrible. Now, I have a question, because when you saw what Justice Kennedy said in United States v. Windsor last summer, he said that DOMA, that section of DOMA, Section 3 that was struck down, was unconstitutional as a deprivation of the liberty of the person protected by the Fifth Amendment. Now, if the State Marriage Defense Act ends up becoming law, what would keep the Supreme Court from using the same rationale used in the DOMA case to strike it down? How have you guarded against that potentiality?
Well, look, at the end of the day, there is always a risk of activist judges, and that is the reason why we ultimately need a constitutional amendment preventing activist judges from undermining marriage.
Right.
And a statute can't permanently tie the hands of judges. But as you noted, the theory behind this bill is the theory that the court relied upon in the Windsor case. Now, the Supreme Court has not been the model of consistency on these issues, so the fact that it was their theory the last time does not necessarily mean that they will abide by it the next time.
Right.
But what the court said last time is the federal government should defer to the marriage laws of the individual states. And what this bill does is it codifies that and says the federal government, as a policy matter, must defer to the marriage laws of the individual states.
Now, what kind of support are you getting for this particular piece of legislation? How can people support getting this passed? What would you say to listeners about that?
Well, we are getting a tremendous outpouring from citizens across the country who are interested in standing up and defending marriage. And what I would encourage your listeners to do is stand up and speak out. Pick up the phone and call your congressman, call your senator, urge them to support the legislation. Go to Facebook, go to Twitter, speak out, and speak out more generally in defense of our liberties, in defense of the values that have made America strong that are facing real threat right now. You know, Janet, I'm encouraged because I do see an awakening that is sweeping this country, a grassroots movement of millions of men and women who are speaking out. And I think that's going to be the answer for turning the country around. The answer is not going to come from Washington. It's going to come from the American people, and I think that's happening right now.
I really hope you're right, and I see some of that myself. And I look, for example, what's been happening in France, where people keep hitting the streets and marching in favor of marriage and the rights of children, really, to have a mom and a dad. That has had an effect, and yet I wonder why in the United States we're not seeing more of that.
Well, I think we are on the ground, but what is missing is leadership. And the courts and the Obama administration are both pressing this assault, and they have had real success undermining marriage. And we need to have citizens who want to stand up for marriage, stand up and speak out. And I think that is happening. And I think it's happening more broadly as we're seeing millions of Americans who are recognizing that our constitutional liberties are being eroded, that the freedom and prosperity and opportunity that has made America so strong has been severely undermined in the last 5 years. And, you know, Ecclesiastes tells us there's nothing new under the sun. And I'm convinced where we are today is very much like the late 1970s. Where in the late 1970s you had Jimmy Carter in the White House, you had the same failed economic policies leading to the same economic malaise and stagnation. You had the same feckless foreign policy. And all across this country, a grassroots movement began that became the Reagan Revolution. Millions of men and women, many people who hadn't been involved in politics, many evangelical Christians who stood up and said, if we don't stand up to fight for our nation, we'll lose it. And it turned this country around.
Well, Texas Senator Ted Cruz, thank you for your leadership, and thank you so much.